Discrimination against disabled people existed long before the Olmstead versus LC case. Laws and acts recognized the issue of discrimination, but they were never enough to fully address the problem. Despite these challenges, the perseverance of disabled individuals and their advocates was evident.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, a well-known president, acquired a sickness, likely polio, resulting in complete paralysis from the waist down. Roosevelt supported founding the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, now known as the March of Dimes, in 1932. In 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, reinforcing permanent assistance for adults with disabilities. Later, in 1950, the parents of children with intellectual disabilities organized the ARC. This organization aimed to change public perceptions of intellectual disability. It guaranteed that approximately 7.2 million Americans with disabilities had the proper support needed to live as regular citizens.
Although many provisions were enforced to protect people with disabilities, they were not enough. For instance, the Civil Rights Act protected women and African Americans in the workplace, but did not extend those same protections to people with disabilities. This demonstrated the continuity of disabled people being denied proper engagement in their communities and opportunities due to discrimination.
Around the 1970s, the independent living movement began when Ed Roberts and other disabled individuals attended the University of California and founded the Berkeley Center for Independent Living. Ed, who had polio, had been forced to live in a hospital and return every night at 10, denying him the basic rights enjoyed by other college students. With federal funding, Roberts created the first Center for Independent Living, assisting disabled individuals in living in their communities with the necessary means of support. This initiative sparked a national movement.
In 1978, the Federal Rehabilitation Act was passed, ensuring protection against discrimination in employment and federally funded programs. This marked a significant milestone as it was the first major federal disability rights law in the U.S. A regional development that influenced the Olmstead case was Georgia's mental health crisis in the 1990s, during which the state faced scrutiny for overfilling institutions and for allegations of neglect and abuse. With inadequate funding for institutions, decreased hospital beds, and outdated practices, this situation called for urgent reform. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, into law, prohibiting discrimination against individuals with disabilities in employment, transportation, public accommodation, communication, and access to state and local government programs. While the ADA included technical assistance outlining the law's provisions, it placed a responsibility on employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified disabled job applicants. The ADA's establishment of these rights directly influenced arguments made in the Olmstead versus LC case.
A telecommunications law passed in the 1930s set the foundation for future accessibility measures. Its revision in 1996 required telecommunication manufacturers and service providers to ensure their equipment was accessible and usable by disabled individuals. This development in telecommunications accessibility played a key role in the arguments made in the Olmstead v. LC case. However, despite these precedents, disabled individuals continued facing everyday discrimination, whether overt or subtle. The Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead v. LC reinforced the basic rights of people with disabilities to live in communities instead of being unnecessarily placed in institutions. This ruling clarified that state governments are responsible for providing services in the least restrictive way. It also had lasting effects, empowering people with disabilities to stand up for their rights, changing public policies to support community-based care, and challenging societal views on inclusion and fairness under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Olmstead v. LC case in 1999 addressed the rights of individuals with disabilities to live in the community rather than being institutionalized. The case significantly impacted the rights of people with mental disabilities and the responsibilities of state and federal governments to ensure their rights were protected. This case began when two women, Louise Curtis and Elaine Wilson, both whom had mental illnesses and developmental disabilities, were confined in a state-run psychiatric institution at Georgia Regional Hospital. Curtis had been institutionalized at age 13 in 1992 and remained there until 1996, even after mental health professionals recommended her discharge to a community-based service. Similarly, Wilson's discharge to a community setting was delayed until 1997, despite her treatment doctor's recommendations in 1995.
Both women sued the state of Georgia under the ADA, arguing that the state failed to provide community-based services recommended by their treatment professionals. On May 11, 1995, with the support of the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, Curtis filed a lawsuit challenging her confinement at Georgia Regional Hospital under Title II of the ADA. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, writing for the majority, affirmed that individuals with disabilities must receive community-based services if appropriate, and it can be reasonably accommodated given the state's resources and the needs of others with disabilities. The court concluded that unjustified institutional isolation of people with disabilities is a form of discrimination.
Years later, on June 22, 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Olmstead v. LC that the unnecessary segregation of individuals with disabilities violated Title II of the ADA.
In the years following the Olmstead v. LC Supreme Court case, many lower court cases reference Olmstead in various contexts, effectively facilitating the integration of disabled individuals into their communities. The case profoundly impacted Medicaid and its role in funding and community-based services, HCBS, for disabled individuals. These services allowed institutionalized individuals to return to their communities and helped those at risk of institutionalization remain safe with proper support. States have continued reducing the cost of institutional care, redirecting funds toward HCBS. While Olmstead did not directly alter Medicaid law, Medicaid remains a major funding source for long-term care, including HCBS, enabling disabled individuals to live independently.
In 2010, nearly 3.2 million people received Medicaid HCBS, costing $52.7 billion. By 2012, close to 524,000 individuals were on HCBS waiver waiting lists, with an average wait time exceeding 2 years, varying by state. States have since reallocated long-term care funding, dedicating more resources to HCBS. The growing population of seniors and disabled individuals benefiting from HCBS and the lower cost of community-based care have driven these efforts. The Supreme Court has significantly heightened state attention to these issues over the past 15 years. While most Medicaid long-term services and supports (LTSS) funds still go toward institutional care, the share allocated to HCBS has steadily risen. In 2002, 32% of Medicaid's LTSS spending went to HCBS, increasing to 45% by 2011. With its far-reaching effects, the Olmstead decision has greatly advanced disability rights in the U.S.
The Olmstead decision had significant short-term effects on how individuals with disabilities were treated. Long-term services and supports, LTSS, helped end the unnecessary segregation of millions placed in institutions simply because they needed help with daily tasks like bathing and dressing. The ruling confirmed that people with disabilities had the right to live in their communities and receive necessary support there, rather than being forced into institutions. While the ruling did not directly lead to all future laws, it was pivotal in pushing for greater community inclusion and better access to resources for disabled individuals.
Developments following the Olmstead ruling continue to emerge. In June 2009, President Obama declared the Year of Community Living to mark the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court case and to recognize the ongoing efforts needed to eliminate discrimination against disabled people. The initiative featured over $140 million in funding for independent living centers and a collaboration between the Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Housing and Urban Development to advocate for community integration.
The Department of Justice, DOJ, also played a significant role. Between 2009 and 2012, the DOJ involved in 40 Olmstead cases across 25 states, investigating violations, initiating litigation, and often reaching settlement agreements. In 2011, the DOJ released a technical assistance guide clarifying the rights of disabled people and the obligations of state and local governments under the ADA's integration mandate. From 1999 to 2010, the Office for Civil Rights settled 850 Olmstead complaints and conducted 581 investigations, many of which required corrective actions.
Another significant development is the proliferation of independent living centers, which now number over 400 across the U.S. Massachusetts, for example, has 10 centers that serve over 12,000 disabled individuals annually. The Americans with Disabilities Act's Amendment Act of 2008 further broadened the definition of disability, allowing more individuals to access protections under the law.
In conclusion, Olmstead v. LC was a turning point in the fight for disability rights, changing how individuals with disabilities are treated and included in society. The ruling affirmed their right to live in the community rather than being confined to institutions, leading to important changes in laws, healthcare, and civil rights protections. Though challenges remain, the Olmstead decision's lasting impact empowers disabled individuals to advocate for their rights, promotes community-based care, and fosters fairness and inclusion. The case has laid the groundwork for ongoing progress, enabling individuals with disabilities to live independently and fully participate in society.